What's up, everybody? I'm Stan, and welcome to Detail Comics, where we go over comics in detail. This is Shelf Appeal, the show where I go over the comic books I picked up this Wednesday, give you my impressions about them, and let you know whether there's something to go back to the shop for or not. So make sure you subscribe to get one of these every single Wednesday. The first book that I want to start talking about is Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps number 32, which is the third part of the Bats Out of Hell tie-in to DC's Dark Knight's Metal. So this is written by Robert Venditti, and it looks like there's a combination of art from Ethan Van Sciver and Liam Sharp. And what we see in this is, I was a little bit hung up on the last issue just because it felt like everything was going to proceed relatively quickly, and what we have is a battle between Hal Jordan and the Dawnbreaker. The Dawnbreaker is easily one of my least favorite versions of these Dark Knights, but it does kind of serve as a surrogate. So Venditti sticks very closely to what he already knows, which is the whole mythos of Hal Jordan, and he really kind of embodies Hal Jordan because he's been writing him for the last 31 issues at this point in time, and there's really a very strong connection with the art style as well. So what we get is, in place of having, four different battles, one between Wonder Woman and Merciless, one between the Drowned and Aquaman, one between, Flash and the Red Death, we actually get Hal Jordan versus the Dawnbreaker in a much more up-close and confrontational combat, which sheds a little bit more light on the actual conflict between these two versions of these Green Lanterns, or the Dawnbreaker versus Hal Jordan. And I found that it was actually particularly effective, because what it did was it gave us a lot more voice to Hal Jordan as part of this conflict. We gave him some, inner core beliefs and things like that, and how he kind of came about in this conflict, and yet ultimately was overcome. And when we get done with the issue, we actually see that everyone was overcome with this, but the real key to this isn't necessarily these various heroes, the members of the Suicide Squad that are up on the Anti-Monitor's tuning fork and various other things, but it's really Cyborg. So that's going to lend us into, the next Justice League issue. That's going to lead us into there, and that's going to be the most important part, because this is either where they make or break Cyborg. So that's going to be pretty interesting, and overall it's kind of rejuvenated my interest in this series that I thought was kind of headed in a weird direction. So definitely good job on those guys for making sure, for having a good plotted out plan, and kind of throwing me a little bit of a curveball that was really going to help out the story. Next, there was another issue that was going to be a little stagnant, and that was Action Comics 991, and another one that just kind of got me by surprise. So this one took what I knew about Action Comics and what I knew about Jor-El, what I knew about Clark, and everything that really embodied that, and instead of using John as a tool, John is really just a disappointed kid in this one, because the real conflict between father and son isn't John versus Superman, it's Superman versus Jor-El, which is the way that it really should be. And what we find out is that Jor-El, he might not necessarily be that bad a guy. There's some twists and turns that come up in this issue. There's a lot of kind of justification for his actions as far as Jor-El's concerned. A lot of real Kryptonian super throwdowns through the Prison of Oz that has been housing all these various creatures, these various people from other timelines or from other points in the universe. And overall, I found that it was very satisfying as far as the way that it concluded. It felt like just a little too easy a way to kind of, break and try and almost redeem Jor-El, but they didn't really make any attempts to redeem him. It was more like, oh, so this is what was happening. This is why he acted against his son, something that a father would never do. So that was very interesting, and ultimately it was just a little cryptic and easy to have the flash of blue light kind of show up and do what it did. But overall, I found that it was a pretty satisfying conclusion, and I can see why it would drive Superman moving forward to kind of pursue various other, solutions to this as he's trying to find Jor-El or prepare himself for the coming confrontation that he's going to have. Overall, Action Comics 991 and the rest of the Oz Effect, very good story, and definitely bumps up a notch as far as the quality of the storytelling is concerned, and something that I really recommend to people, especially if you have the opportunity to go back to the first issue of the arc. This is 5 parts, definitely going to be something that's going to read well in trade. Then we can talk about the other big Oz story that's been happening, and that's The Lonely Place of Living, which continues and concludes in Detective Comics 968. So this is Tim Drake's Batman from the future versus Tim Drake's Red Robin and the rest of the Bat team. And what we see is a lot of satisfaction as far as this is really concerned. You don't really get any spoiler. There's no Stephanie Brown that shows up in this. But what you do get is you get a lot of understanding as to where Tim Drake's coming from as far as the future is concerned, and the present, and the lengths that he'll go to kind of take care of these measures. So between the actual confrontation that's inside the Belfry and inside the Batcave, you get a lot of character development for Tim Drake from the future, and a bit better understanding as to what he really believes and how he feels things are going to be moving forward, and the lengths that he's going to go to do those things. The biggest thing is that now we have a ticking clock, because the temporal displacement, the hyper time, time itself is fighting against Tim Drake and is going to send him back where he's meant to be. So this is a pretty interesting concept that's kind of going along with this, and I'm really interested to see where this kind of goes in the future, because there's been insinuations of other signs of Batman of Tomorrow, or a particular version of the Batman of Tomorrow, showing up in future issues of other comic books. So I'm kind of curious as to see whether, you know, Tim Drake is just repeatedly going to be jumping into the past, trying to solve these problems of the past before they become problems of the future, or before they determine a future that's far less savory than the one that they're in now. So I'm really excited about where this is going to go, but it's diving into the fall of the Batman kind of arc, and this implicates, or it implies, that Kate Kane's Batwoman is going to have a pretty good turn, or she's going to have a pivotal role in the next story arc, so I'm excited to see where that one goes. Detective Comics after this arc is definitely back on my reading list, simply because it's just great story. It's good storytelling, and I don't know why I never dropped it in the first place. So definitely something that I'd recommend. Pick up A Lonely Place of Living and all the other pieces of this story arc. Definitely a good one to read. Of course, if we're talking about great books to read, you can't make a statement of that without having Mr. Miracle #4 on there. Because Mr. Miracle has hands down been one of the most surprising and one of the most sophisticated, definitely been one of the most exciting books coming out of DC. Tom King and Mitch Gerads have been doing a phenomenal job with this book, and I just can't sing enough praise of it. And this is really interesting because ultimately we just open up with very simple things. You know, we've got oh man, from the opening scene where we just got Big Barda and Scott Free laying down in bed, and then ultimately Light Ray comes in and Big Barda threatens to shove a cosmic rod up his ass, and then, you know, he's like, oh yeah, you're gonna have a trial, where do you want to choose a trial? And Scott, hanging out in his Green Lantern t-shirt, is just like, yeah, we'll have it here or whatever, it doesn't really matter, you know, trial, whatever, good. And then Big Bart is getting super pissed, and then Light Ray looks at her and says thank you, and she just beats the ever-living crap out of it, and it's just amazing, it's phenomenal. And then when we get to the actual, you know, we get another one of those kind of gags, you know, where we're talking about Scott Free's escape and what kind of setup he does for his tricks and how he performs. We get some, you know, Glorious Godfrey on the television set mixed with a little bit of Granny Goodness, which is really interesting. And then ultimately we get to the trial of Scott Free's Mr. Miracle, which reads like a damn freight train. You know, it's just one of those things where it's just like it starts off slower, and then it builds speed, and it builds speed, and it builds power until you get finally to the crescendo, the moment, and it's just phenomenal storytelling, both visually. I found myself flipping pages faster and faster, but I'm going to do a full review on Mr. Miracle #4, so definitely check that out to get a few more details on exactly what's going on in this story. I'm going to dive real deep. Then there's another book you should be taking a deep dive on, and that is Daredevil 595. So Daredevil 595 from Charles Soule is starting off a major arc, which should have some tectonic shifts within the Marvel Universe. First off, Wilson Fisk has become mayor of New York City. And that is, by definition, one of the most powerful positions inside the entirety of the United States. And this does not sit very well with Daredevil, with Matt Murdock, either of them, in any kind of sense. And what we see is the beginning of what's hopefully going to be a much longer and much overbearing kind of story arc that's going to impact a lot of the Marvel Universe, because I can't see how it wouldn't. You know, if we're talking about Spider-Man, the mayor of New York impacts Spider-Man. The mayor of New York impacts Luke Cage, impacts Jessica Jones, impacts Danny Rand, Iron Fist, impacts Daredevil. Hell, don't the X-Men live in Central, you know, Park right now? Isn't their mansion right there? So, like, this is going to have a huge implication, or at least it should. It should have a huge impact on the Marvel Universe at large. So I'm really excited to see where this goes and what other kind of books pick up on the specifics of this entire story arc. I got to give Charles Soule some real you know, praise for this one, simply because it's so well thought out, it's so logical, it's so plausible, especially given the current climate that we're in, that this happens. And it doesn't seem, it feels like Wilson Fisk, given the legitimate route that he took, could be a good guy. And that's the best part, because it makes you believe that the bad guy can be the good guy and that the good guy can be the bad guy, and it's just this great turn. I'm going to do a full review on Daredevil 595, so that's another video that you should watch out for. I'm going to take a deep dive into this one and what it could mean for the Marvel Universe. Before we dive into the big book of the week, I do want to talk about Harbinger Renegade #0. So from Valiant Universe, Harbinger Renegade #0 is meant to really be catch-up. It's giving you an implication or an idea as to what's going on currently in the Harbinger Renegade universe. And with Harbinger Renegade #0, we get an introduction into the hardcore, we get introduction to Alexander Solomon, you know, Omen. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's really going on that's giving you an idea as to what kind of environment the story of Harbinger Renegade is going to be taking place, and it's setting up the foundations of what's going to become Harbinger War in May. So, having no idea what's going on, I found that it gave me a little bit more understanding as to what's going on, a little bit more core fundamental understanding of, you know, the hardcore of, you know, the release of the Alpha of Alexander Solomon and everything that's going on in the book. It's not necessarily enough to drag me in to you know, picking up Harbinger Renegade right now. However, I can kind of see it influencing me to pick up Harbinger Wars, which is coming out in May. So it's definitely something that I'm interested in. Overall, the art style was particularly fun. I didn't really see anything wrong with it, and the story seemed pretty kind of, for what it is, taking everything out of context, I felt like I could understand everything pretty well, and everything seemed to move in a pretty good pace. So it's not necessarily something that I'm saying, yeah, you got to go out and you must buy it, but it's something that I enjoyed. It's not necessarily for everybody. If you're not familiar with the Valiant Universe, there are other areas where you could start off, like Bloodshot Salvation and Exo Manowar, which are just, you know, like, you can dive right into those stories on issue number 1 and have a great time. Of course, this does lead us to the big bad book of the week, and that is Batman Lost number 1. So Batman Lost number 1 is a trip. Like, literally, it's a trip. You know, it is the journey of Bruce Wayne through this dark multiverse and a bunch of different parallels that he's already seen or experienced or other various stories. This is a love letter to Grant Morrison and his idea of the return of Bruce Wayne. It's very much everything about the Dark Knight being told by the Dark Knight in the form of stories called the Dark Knight. There's great Easter eggs inside the 78-year-old Bruce Wayne's house where he's talking to his you know, like, granddaughter, you know, who he insists to go play with the cousins. You know, she wants to hear a Batman story. She doesn't want to hear about Zora. She wants to hear a Batman story. And then he tells her a Batman story that takes odd twists and turns and that kind of flips his universe on its head and gives him an indication that he's not necessarily where he needs to be. There's cameos by prominent players inside the DC universe that make a huge difference to things and then ultimately skew Batman's perspective. And then we find out more about who Barbatos is. So I'm going to be doing a full review on Batman Lost number 1, and it's got me thinking on a pretty serious theory that I think I'm going to do a full video on too. So those are two things that you definitely should be looking out for. But I'm really, you need to buy Batman Lost number 1. If you have any understanding, if you have any kind of interest in metal, Batman Lost number 1 is something that you can't really miss at this point in time. You just can't. So it's definitely a must-buy. But I want to know what you guys think too, so hit me up in the comments down below so we can start that conversation. As always, if you like what you see, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to get more news, reviews, and commentary on comic books, comic book movies, comic book TV shows and games, and anything and everything inside the world of comics.